Hey, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'll get straight into what I'm going to talk about because I've chosen the biblical book of Habakkuk to speak about this afternoon. And I suppose to begin with, you might think I'm jumping on a bandwagon because of the recent world events. And of course, considering the contents that the book of Habakkuk has. But I chose this subject when Sally first got in touch with me, and that was long before the awful situation that we're witnessing in Ukraine. So why did I choose Habakkuk to talk to you this afternoon? Well, it's only a very small book, isn't it? Of 3 chapters, and it's in the middle of a section of the Bible we call, of course, the 12 minor prophets. And a reading of the book leaves us with so many questions about human behavior towards one another and God's seeming inactivity at just the time when we would have expected him to intervene and sort it all out. Well, I believe the messages of all the prophets are profitable for us, even in our day and generation. And certainly Habakkuk would fit that criteria. Obviously, of course, in the short time that we have, we can't engage in a chapter by chapter, verse by verse exposition. And that's not the intention of my talk. Rather, we're going to just look generally at the book and also maybe bring out a few verses, some I'm sure will be very familiar to you, and to see the general flow of how Habakkuk goes through his 3 chapters. But first, just a few points of general information. Who was Habakkuk? Well, the first verse of his book says simply, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. The Hebrew is masah, and of course it means burden, pronouncement, prophecy, oracle. Well, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Greek word is lema, and that, of course, is translated as argument or message. In the dictionary of classical Hebrew, the Hebrew word gives these different explanations: utterance, pronouncement, speech, burden, and load. And the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament says about this word oracle, when it refers to a prophetic oracle, it usually means a proclamation of disaster. Well, we know for certain Habakkuk was a prophet, and that the prophecy granted to him was in the form of a vision. It says right at the beginning, he saw. But is that it? Is that all the information on the prophet himself and on the historical context of his ministry? Well, the second verse goes straight into Habakkuk's complaint. So what do we really know about Habakkuk? Well, it's generally accepted that the prophet was writing during the demise of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of Babylon. For in chapter 1 and verse 6, there's a reference in the Hebrew to the Kasdim, the Chaldeans. So a date towards the end of the 7th century BC is obviously a good choice, because by 625 BC, Babylon was quickly gaining power. They defeated Assyria in 612 BC, and then Pharaoh Necho of Egypt in 605 BC. And of course, that made Babylon the controlling power over the ancient Near East region. And therefore, it impacted the nation of Judah. It seems that the book is set before the deportation of Judah into exile in Babylon, which happened in 597 and 586 BC. And in chapter 2 and verse 20 of Habakkuk, the temple is mentioned, where it says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." It would appear that the temple in Jerusalem was still standing, for it is still described as the dwelling of God. So there's no indication at this point that the temple has been destroyed by the Babylonians. So time-wise, therefore, we're probably looking at the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, who reigned from 609 to 598 BC. Well, we don't know anything about the background of Habakkuk. We don't know his family, his lineage, where he lived, the time span of his prophetic ministry. In fact, there's no more information on whether he had a longer ministry or not. His name is only mentioned twice in the canon of scripture, and both are in the book of Habakkuk itself, chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 3, verse 1. One thing we can say is that Habakkuk is unique in the Old Testament, in that his book is a sustained dialogue between Habakkuk and Yahweh. Well, the name Habakkuk has been interpreted as meaning embraced, or love's embrace, or he that embraces. Yet in spite of what I have just said, there are some interesting thoughts that have arisen to try to fill in the gaps. The first one is quite possible. Habakkuk was a cultic prophet, closely associated with the temple in Jerusalem. If so, he would be of the tribe of Levi. And this idea comes from the liturgical nature of chapter 3 of the book and the fact that it is set to music. In chapter 3, verse 1, it says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to the Shigionoth. And in chapter 3, verse 19, right at the end, it says, to the choir master with string instruments. Another theory is that Habakkuk was the watchman referred to in Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 6. And this is what Isaiah said, for thus the Lord said to me, go set a watchman, let him announce what he sees. Because of course we know that Habakkuk himself stood upon a watchtower in chapter 2 and verse 1, where it says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And of course, we'll come to the complaint in a few moments. Well, two legends have arisen. One, some rabbis thought that Habakkuk was the son of the Shunammite woman during the prophet Elisha's time. We see that in 2 Kings chapter 4. But this, of course, sets the time scale sometime before the reign of Jehoiakim. So it's a problem. And the second is in the apocryphal book of the additions to Daniel, in a part called Bel and the Dragon. Habakkuk was transported by an angel to Daniel in the lion's den during the Persian Empire under Darius. He took Daniel some food and was then transported back home. As one commentator says, none of these legends have any historical value, for this sets Habakkuk, of course, after the end of the Babylonian Empire. So we're going to look at Habakkuk under three headings. Of course, the message of the book in its original context, the interpretation of the book from a Jewish and Christian perspective, and the place of the book in the church today. And the simple outline is that there's a superscription at the beginning. There are two complaints by the prophet Habakkuk. There are two responses by God to those complaints. And then there's Habakkuk's prayer in chapter 3. So it's quite a simple set out of the book of Habakkuk in those three chapters. So let's look at the original context. We've established that the likely timescale of the book is during the rise of the Babylonian Empire, just before the defeat of Judah and the beginning of the exile. And the textual evidence points to two nations being mentioned in the book, Judah and Babylon. Of course, Babylon is mentioned by the name Chaldeans. Habakkuk begins by complaining to God, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? That's in chapter 1, verse 2. Here in this first complaint, we get some information about Habakkuk. He was obviously a person of deep spiritual longing. He had a high view of God's power and sovereignty and a sense of justice and morality. It is here in these opening verses of chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, that we realize Habakkuk is looking out over his nation of Judah, and all he can see is violence, iniquity, strife, contention, injustice, and wickedness. Even the Torah, the law, is paralyzed and justice is perverted. The righteous are surrounded by the wicked, and wickedness prevails and overpowers all that would be right and true. What a complaint. He doesn't spare his anger and frustration at the situation, but it goes deeper and darker now, for each complaint against Judah is set against a question to the Lord. You don't seem to hear. You will not save. You stand idly by while iniquity flourishes. The burden is easy to recognize. God seems to be silent and inactive in the desperate situation of Judah's wickedness. The dialogue is gritty, it's straight to the point. Yet even in this situation, we see a prophet who feels he can confront God directly. There is here a positive, for he knows God and is on speaking terms with him. As a true prophet of the Lord, Habakkuk is deeply concerned about injustice in Judah, and he knows that God is almighty and just, and therefore he expects God to act for his people. Habakkuk's faith is such that even in these perplexities at the beginning of his dialogue with God, he is confident to address God in this way. And of course, in this, we're reminded of the Psalms and the way in which they approach God directly in prayer and in lamentation, in questioning and in pleading. Well, God, of course, responds to Habakkuk's complaint in the following verses of chapter 1, verses 5 to 11. And his answer is not what the prophet wanted to hear. God encourages Habakkuk to widen his horizons from Judah to the nations, and specifically the Chaldeans. God says that the Chaldeans are going to be the instruments of divine justice against the perpetrators of injustice in Judah. So here is the dilemma. The Chaldeans are fearsome in their attack. It likens them to leopards, wolves, and eagles, who all hunt down their prey and show no mercy. God rebuffs Habakkuk. He is not silent or inactive, but he is using the Chaldeans to fulfill his purposes, even though they worship idols, are violent, and have no regard for human life, and are fearless. Yes, God is going to act against the violence. He's going to act against injustice and failure to obey the Torah in Judah. But his action is totally different from what Habakkuk expects. Even in this perplexing response, God is widening Habakkuk's horizons beyond Judah to the wider world. And God declares he is not silent to Habakkuk's complaint of how long. God answers, in your days. At the end, there is a hint that the Chaldeans too will be judged guilty because they have made their own might and power their God. But the situation seems to get worse. If God is the God of justice, then the idea of allowing more injustice seems incomprehensible to the prophet. He feels his complaint has not been answered. And so he comes back with his second complaint in the rest of chapter 1. He now appeals to the character of God. Lord, you are eternal. You are the creator, the master of the world. You are holy. You're stable as a rock. You're reliable. You're trustworthy. He's so pure he cannot look upon evil. So the prophet asks, why does God not act according to his character over injustice and evil, wickedness, destruction, and idolatry? The prophet cannot reconcile that the Babylonians can be an instrument in God's hands. The problem looks like getting much worse than getting better. And so Habakkuk's questions are still the same. Why does God remain silent? Why do the wicked swallow up the righteous? And Habakkuk uses metaphors to illustrate. He uses fish. The Babylonians, he says, catch people like fish in a net, making them prisoners of war. There's no escape. The fishing tackle used to capture people is worshipped with sacrifices and offerings. This superior military might is honored in a religious way. Their military power is deified. I'm sure we can look around our world today and see how that's still true today. And Habakkuk ends his complaint with a question in chapter 1 and verse 17. Is he then, meaning Babylon, to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? And so we come to chapter 2, and Habakkuk stands on a watchtower to wait and see what God will do. In the superscription in chapter 1, verse 1, it says that he saw the oracle. In chapter 1, verse 3, it says, why do you make me see iniquity? And God's response in chapter 1, verse 5 was, look and see. And now Habakkuk on his watchtower is waiting to see what God will do. Well, here's just a little aside. The Chaldeans, it says, laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Meaning, of course, they have ramps to make sure that they can capture the cities. That's in chapter 1 and verse 10. And the earlier example of Lachish in Israel and the siege ramp of the Assyrians comes into mind. There are watchtowers on Lachish, on Azekah, and Jerusalem, and they stand in a straight line from Lachish in the south, Azekah in the middle, and Jerusalem, of course, towards the north. And later, concerning Babylon, Jeremiah in 34 verse 7 says, when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, Lachish and Azekah for these were the only 45 cities of Judah that remain. And in the Lachish ostraca, it says, we are watching out for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. And so we see why, of course, Habakkuk is on his watchtower. He's wanting to see what God is going to do. After all, he's got this history behind him of the watchtower being a signal there when, of course, people are attacking, and how you've got to warn those around of what is happening. And so he's watching over the nation of Judah. He's complained of the injustice and idolatry of Jehoiakim's rule, but Babylon will be even worse. How can this be possible? Why does God allow it? Often it's only with hindsight that we detect God's actions. Even though Habakkuk does not understand God's actions, he does not lose faith. He still appeals to the God he knows, the holy God from all eternity, who cannot be indifferent to injustice. Here we see the close relationship between the prophet and God. It is so open and frank that he is not afraid to pose the difficult questions. And so God comes back with a second response in the rest of chapter 2. Habakkuk is told to write down the vision that God reveals to him. There's no indication of the time lapse between Habakkuk's second complaint and God's reply. God works in his own time, and Habakkuk waits for on his watchtower. The message must be made public so that it could be read easily. Make it plain, God says. The vision can be trusted. It will be fulfilled in its appointed time. So wait for it. It will come soon. And one commentator says these words: the problem is not God's inability to notice the destruction and injustice in society. The problem is the lack of patience on the part of the prophet. Well, we come to that wonderful verse, of course, in chapter 2 and verse 4, where it says, the righteous shall live by his faith. Because, of course, in that verse, it contains the answer to Habakkuk's complaints. In the end, those who are puffed up, as the Babylonians and the Judeans are at this point, will not stand. Those who are righteous, those living their lives by God's standards, will prevail. They will remain steadfast, reliable, trustworthy through these difficult times. The righteous will overcome the current period because they have kept the faith by remaining faithful to God. The righteous will live by and through faith in him. They will trust God come what may, but the wicked will continue in their ways and therefore will not succeed. They will end up being betrayed by their own greed for more and more power. So the vision still does not explain or justify God's actions. The point is not how God controls world affairs, it is how believers in him react to difficult times. Then come 5 woes that God brings to Habakkuk, and these are against the Babylonians. This is not only true for them, but it is a general truth applicable to all oppressive forces. The first woe concerns judgment and doom. Both Babylon and Judah have acquired possessions unjustly. The rich and the arrogant, there is violence. They brutally seized power by initiating unjust loans. The second woe is the downfall of the wicked. Through evil games and practices, they feel they're safe. They protect themselves out of reach of harm, but they will come to an end. The third woe, those building their empire by bloodshed and iniquity will fail. Suddenly, right in the middle of all these woes, there's a wonderful verse in verse 14 of chapter 2. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's almost a direct quote from Isaiah 11 verse 9, where Isaiah says, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And of course, there's also an echo from Psalm 72 verse 19. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. God is the Lord of hosts, the Almighty. He is Lord over all. So he is not inactive. He is not unaware of what's happening all around. In the fourth woe, there's a cynical ploy that's observed concerning the Babylonians. They use excessive wine on their neighbors, getting them so drunk that they behave in an uninhibited manner. becoming naked, losing any dignity and self-worth, bringing on themselves shame and humiliation. But God says he will put on the Babylonians the same humiliation. There will be judgment on the evil and wicked powers, and they will be put to shame. The bloodshed and destruction they have caused will rebound on them. And in this fourth woe, we see the hint that God cares for his creation, not just human beings suffering under foreign powers, but he also cares about the trees of Lebanon, cut down in scorched earth policy, and the animal kingdom too. God is the universal creator God who cares deeply for all his creation. And the fifth and last woe turns to the futility of worshipping idols. And so the question comes, who do you worship? How does this affect the decisions you make? What profit is there in worshipping man-made images? Man has created these idols from wood, metal, and stone. They cannot speak. They're useless, lifeless, silent. And verse 19 says, there is no breath at all in it. But now comes this wonderful, great contrast. The living God, the one who gave breath to all creation, is active. And it says in verse 20 and the end of chapter 2, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. We must wait in silence for God to speak, for he is going to intervene. You can bet on it. And so after all that, we come to the final chapter 3, which of course is a total contrast in a way to those first two chapters. The prayer, the psalm of Habakkuk. In verse 1, there's a second superscription. And so this begins a new unit. And after the vision, this is Habakkuk's response by way of a prayer, probably set to music and to be used by a choir. But the prayer has some wonderful moments, uplifting phrases I'm sure you're familiar with. In the midst of the years, revive your work, Lord. And also in wrath, remember mercy, in verse 2 of chapter 3. The prophet humbles himself in God's presence as he prays. He stands in awe of God and his deeds. He believes that what God has done in the past, he will perform in the present and in the future. Habakkuk is confident that because God has brought deliverance in the past, he will do so again, even though at present there's turmoil all around. He states that the Lord is coming. He sees the majesty and power of God. No one will be able to stand in his way. Nations will tremble. All will bow to his sovereignty and kingship. Habakkuk pictures God as a warrior riding horses with chariots. He's angry against injustice, and he will come to save his people and crush the wicked, for victory belongs to God. And Habakkuk is overwhelmed. He will wait patiently for it all to unfold. He physically trembles with holy fear. Yet this fear is tempered with unshakable trust and faith in the God he knows. He realizes it is not for him to try to force God to act. He must wait, convinced that God will intervene on a day that he will decide upon. So Habakkuk's confession of unshakable faith is in the next two verses of 17 to 19. He's been dealing with social issues of injustice, of violence, of idolatry, of destruction and wickedness. And then the verses here turn to the illustration of a farmer trying to make a living. The different produce covers the essentials for living in the Old Testament: fruit, olives for cooking, grapes and wine, grain to bake bread, clothing from sheepskins, and milk and meat. Even if all these fail, Habakkuk says, I'm going to wait upon God to intervene. Here is complete trust and faith. Not only that, in spite of circumstances, he will rejoice in the Lord, the God of his salvation, the God who is his strength. This is a personal confession of faith. The prophet will continue to put his faith in God no matter what. God is no longer seeming to be aloof or inactive. He is close, personal, active in the midst of all the turmoil. Thus we have a wonderful ending. The deer on the high places, sure-footed, safe. Habakkuk's faith is sure and safe. He's a living example of what it means to live by faith. So let's have a look just briefly then at the interpretation of Habakkuk from a Jewish and Christian perspective. Well, down through the centuries, since the compilation, of course, of the Tanakh Jewish Bible, and of course the LXX Greek Septuagint, which of course was a translation of the Hebrew text in the 2nd century BC. And up until recently, the oldest Old Testament manuscript, the Masoretic text, Hebrew text, was around 1000 AD. But in the mid-20th century, some wonderful finds came from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD, down by the Dead Sea. I'm sure you're all familiar with, of course, many biblical texts, most in Hebrew and a few in Greek. Only the book of Esther was missing. Hundreds of scrolls and fragments confirm the books we have in our Bibles. These ancient texts were discovered hidden in caves near the site of Qumran at the Dead Sea. Among the fragments, the 12 minor prophets with portions of Habakkuk were recovered from one of the caves, named Cave 4. There were also fragments of Habakkuk found at Wadi Murabaat, south of Qumran, and at Nahal Hever, which is near Ein Gedi. Those at Nahal Hever were in Greek. And all 3 chapters are represented in these manuscripts. So now we have gone back over 1000 years, from about 1000 AD to before the time of our Lord Jesus. So to the first known interpretation of Habakkuk from a Jewish perspective, it was found in what was designated Cave 1, and it was 1Q Pesher Habakkuk. So from Cave 1, a Pesher of Habakkuk, a commentary on the book was found and discovered. Well, I'm sure many of you know the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they were discovered in 1947 by Muhammad Eddib, a young Bedouin herding goats by the Dead Sea. Of course, he found these scrolls, 7 scrolls in all, and he took them to Bethlehem, to Kando, a cobbler and antiquities dealer. And they thought at first that they could be used to repair sandals. Thank goodness they didn't try to. But after seeing writing on the scrolls, they took them to St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem. Remember, this was taking place during the ending of the British Mandate, just before 1948, and the birth of the modern nation of Israel. These 7 scrolls that were found in a cave that they designated Cave 1, well, the Metropolitan of the monastery bought 4 of them, and a Professor Sukanek of Hebrew University bought the other 3. In 1951, the 4 scrolls were put up for sale in the USA, and the newly formed state of Israel purchased them. And I'm sure many of you have been to the Shrine of the Book and seen them there. These scrolls were believed to belong to a Qumran sect called the Essenes. And in total, 11 caves were excavated around the Qumran site in the 1950s, and over 900 scrolls and many thousands of fragments were found, large and small pieces. And of course, at the same time, the site of Qumran was excavated. Well, in this commentary on the book of Habakkuk, found at the beginning in that Cave 1, it was photographed in 1948, translated and published in the early 1950s, and was given a date of around 100 BC. And it was called the Pesher of Habakkuk, or plural Pesherim, and it means interpretation, commentary. And this scroll is among the oldest examples of this method, citing a scriptural verse or section and then offering an explanation of it. This commentary only refers to chapters 1 and 2 of Habakkuk. Chapter 3 is not included. I wonder why. It's thought by some scholars that the final verse in chapter 2 brings it to a logical conclusion for the ancient commentator, designated the teacher of righteousness, who was the leader of the Essene community. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And then it gave an interpretation, which concerns all the nations who have served the stone and the wood. But on the day of judgment, God will destroy completely all who serve idols and the evil ones from the land. So the interpretations deal with the history of the Essene community and with the latter days. Well, we've seen the teacher of righteousness is probably the author of this Pesher of Habakkuk. And in chapter 2 and verse 4, of course, and the righteous man will live by his faithfulness. This is what the interpretation is. It concerns all those who observe the Torah in the house of Judah, whom God will save from the house of judgment on account of their tribulations and their fidelity to to the righteous teacher. It also mentioned some people called the Kittim. Well, who are the Kittim? In chapter 1 and verse 6, it says, "For now I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation." Well, the interpretation in the Pesher of Habakkuk says it concerns the Kittim, who are swift and strong in battle. The Kittim are usually identified as the Romans. So the writer of the Habakkuk Pesher believed that the prophet, who was active in the late 600 BC, wrote down events that would happen in the first century BC. The Qumran Essenes interpreted this for their own time. They believed they were a chosen community and that they were living in the end of days. The overall purpose is to encourage the faithful to stay the course and not be discouraged by an apparent delay in the coming of the end time. Professor F.F. Bruce says this about the Qumran community. In the Qumran Pesher, each phrase is made to fit into a new historical situation. The original context is ignored. Well, so from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, we move to the time of the Mishnah and the Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud in 400 AD and the Babylonian Talmud in 500 AD. And in the Sanhedrin tractate, Habakkuk 2 verse 3 is used. "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay." This refers to the redemption that will take place during the Messianic era, for Messiah will come and will not delay. And in the tractate Makos, about chapter 2 and verse 4 of Habakkuk, it says, "Habakkuk came and established the 613 mitzvot upon one, as it is stated, but the righteous person shall live by his faith." And the Avodah Zarah also says that just as a fish, when placed on dry land, immediately dies, so it is with the Jew. As soon as he departs from the Torah and the mitzvos, he immediately dies. Well, through the Middle Ages, a number of famous rabbis brought their expertise to the biblical texts in commentaries, including Habakkuk. There was Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Abravanel, and of course the Zohar, a mystical treatise of the 14th century. Moving on to modern times, some Jewish scholars take the opinion of the Zohar that Habakkuk was the son of the Shunammite woman from the time of Elisha the prophet. Rabbi Rosenberg and Dr. Mendel Hirsch quote this in their commentaries on Habakkuk. And from Israel, Rabbi Yaakov Beasley in 2020, in his comments on chapter 2, verse 4 of Habakkuk, "The righteous will live by his faith," says, Habakkuk's statement provided Judaism's response to that ever-present question, why do good people suffer and the wicked flourish? The relevance of Habakkuk's message and his spiritual struggles are timeless. He invites the reader to eavesdrop on his conversation with God as he wrestles with issues of divine justice. Redemption may tarry, but it will come. And Habakkuk chapter 3 is one of the Haftarah readings on Shavuot in the Jewish tradition. And in morning prayers during the weekdays, Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 2, "Amid rage, remember, be merciful," is repeated several times in the morning services in the synagogue. One of the prayers in the morning service is this in the synagogue: "I believe with complete faith in the coming of the Messiah, and even though he may delay, nevertheless, I anticipate every day that he will come." And so on this section, a final word from Rabbi Weiss in Israel. The prophets convey God's message to the people. In Habakkuk, the prophet conveys questions to God. The message was understood to span generations. Each era faces its own challenges to their beliefs, but we are called upon to trust in Hashem, the Lord, and his righteousness. So let's have a look at the Christian use of Habakkuk before we come to our conclusion. As early as the late 40s to 60s AD, of course, that famous verse in chapter 2 and verse 4 of Habakkuk was being used in the New Testament letters sent out to those early believers in Jesus across the Roman Empire. In Romans 1:17, of course, Paul, in his letter written about 57 AD, "But the righteous will live by faith." Faith is indispensable to live a righteous life, even in the midst of turmoil and uncertainty. And in the letter to the Galatians, written in the late 40s AD, in Galatians 3, verse 11, Paul again uses the quote from Habakkuk 2, verse 4, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Here, Paul uses the character Abraham as an example of living by faith. His interpretation, of course, is different from the Essenes, who looked to the Torah. Paul said, of course, the law could not save. It was only through Jesus that we could have salvation and become righteous. And in Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 37 to 38, the author again uses Habakkuk 2, verse 4, to contrast the righteous who live by faith in God with the wicked who reject him. This is used to encourage the believers to hold fast until the coming again of the Messiah. And of course, in Habakkuk 2, verse 3, it states that the one coming will not delay. And Hebrews 11:37 says, the one who is coming will come and will not delay. So, of course, they're using those verses from Habakkuk in the New Testament. And Habakkuk, according to the sidebar references in the Greek New Testament, the 28th edition, in all, 11 of the 27 books of the New Testament have references to the book of Habakkuk. So down through the Christian centuries, biblical exegetes have continued to use Habakkuk 2:4 in their reflections on Romans 1:17 and Galatians 3:11. Martin Luther, of course, in a famous quote, said this, there I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith. Here I felt I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. There a totally new face of the entire scripture showed itself to me. And John Calvin, in his commentary on Habakkuk, says, if it be objected that the prophet exceeded moderation, the obvious answer is this, that though he freely pours forth his feelings, there was nothing wrong in this before God. At least nothing wrong is imputed to him. For wherefore do we pray, but that each of us may unburden his cares, his griefs, his anxieties, by pouring them into the bosom of God. And in his comment on Habakkuk 2, verse 4, Calvin says, what does the just do? He brings nothing before God except faith. Then he brings nothing of his own. Though the whole world may perish or be exposed to various changes, yet the faithful shall continue in permanent and real safety. And so, of course, we could go on. Some modern commentators also use important truths in Habakkuk. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones in 1953, in his book on Habakkuk, called From Fear to Faith, says that the anxiety of the situation in Habakkuk's day is experienced by people today. Immorality, injustice, the law not applied equitably and honestly. All this is followed by a general moral, political, and spiritual decline. In the fourth woe of Habakkuk 2, verses 15 to 17, it says, the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beast that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. And several modern commentators today see here a concern for the ecology of the earth. We see, says one commentator, that God not only cares for human beings suffering from violence of a foreign power, but he also cares for the trees of Lebanon, as well as the animals roaming the forests of Lebanon. God is the universal creator who cares for his creation. Human exploitation of the earth is an offense against nature, but more importantly, it is a sin committed against and deserving to be punished by God, the creator of heaven and earth. And so even there, we see some reference to, of course, the creation that God has made. But of course, we wait for that day that Habakkuk 2:14 describes, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So to come to a conclusion, let's bring it down really to more personal and to worship. How do we respond to this information today? Well, I'm going to bring you several little illustrations that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and it's all to do with worship. William Cowper, in the 18th century hymn writer, put it like this: God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. So that's William Cowper. And also he wrote another hymn, of course, sometimes a light surprises the Christian while he sings. And those wonderful words in the last verse of that hymn, where he writes, though vine nor fig tree neither their wonted fruit should bear, though all the field should wither, nor flocks nor herds be there, yet God the same abiding, his praise shall tune my voice, for while in him confiding, I cannot but rejoice. So as we look around us at the situation in the world with hatred and warfare, climate problems, we can sometimes feel overwhelmed like Habakkuk, but this is where our faith comes in. We must be so open with God that we can come to him. And of course, in that lovely chorus, all your anxieties, all your cares, bring to the mercy seat and leave them there. Then we will be able to join Habakkuk in his prayerful song of rejoicing, if we have complete faith and trust in the living God. If we wait on him, then we should be like the deer, sure-footed on the heights of the cliffs, as Habakkuk ends his book. And we've seen those deer, we've seen those ibex on the cliffs outside Ein Gedi, and how sure-footed they were as they sort of roamed across the cliffs down there by the Dead Sea. What a wonderful picture of what the Christian can be like. We shall be assured that God is working his purposes out. That old hymn says, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Well, the book of Habakkuk is often neglected today. When did you last hear a reading from it in a church service, let alone a sermon based upon it? And even in the lectionary, the 3-year cycle, there's only one reference to the book of Habakkuk in the church readings. And so, of course, it can be a model for our lives. Openness with God, an expectation that the righteous who remain loyal to God will triumph, that evil in all its forms will ultimately be defeated, and that the kingdom of God will be victorious. I'd just like to end with a right up-to-date 21st century song written by one of the leading hymn writers, songwriters of the 21st century, Matt Redman. In all of our questions, all of our searching, when we are wrestling, you don't let go. In all of our fears and doubts, all our anxious thoughts, when we are restless, still we are held. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. The questions come, but you remain. The battles roar, but still you reign. And I believe one thing will never change. You are faithful. You are faithful. In all of our chaos, you will be constant. You can be trusted above it all. All of our fears and doubts, all our anxious thoughts, you are not absent within the storm. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. The questions come, but you remain. The battles roar, but still you reign. And I believe one thing will never change. You are faithful. You are faithful. Thank you.
Ray, thank you very much. I can see out there in Zoom land, lots of people putting thumbs up and giving you a round of applause. I think some people may even have burst into song and joined in with that Redman classic. So that's great. And so thank you, Ray. Just a couple of questions people have asked. I haven't seen anything on the chat, but people have put something.